Would it displease you if I walked over and punched Henry Kissinger in the face?
You hate Henry.
You hate him.
Yeah.
Go take balls for the arrest of Henry Kissinger for war crimes.
Of all the major figures in the Cold War, very few were as decisive as the American diplomat by the name of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was a highly influential government official for the United States. He served as the US Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor for Presidents Nixon and Ford. He instituted policies that helped to ease tensions with the Soviet Union. He also opened up trade relations with China, and he helped to end the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. Most notably though, he negotiated the Paris Peace Accords, which ended the American involvement in the Vietnam War. And for this, he was awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize, something that was highly controversial. Now, it's no surprise that some people thought of Kissinger as a master statesman, someone who played a key role in furthering the influence of the United States. Others, however, have a far less flattering view of him. In fact, there are theories that Kissinger was indirectly responsible for over 3 million deaths during the course of his career. So the question is, how do you figure out Henry Kissinger? Was he all bad? Did he have any positive impact at all? Also, what were the true economic and human costs of his policies? And that's exactly what we want to explore in today's video. By the way, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel as we put out weekly videos on historical financial topics, so make sure you don't miss out. Okay, back to Kissinger. To understand Kissinger, you need to understand his childhood. Henry Kissinger's style of leadership is called realpolitik, which meant he focused his politics based on practical objectives, on realism rather than on idealism. And many argue that his traumatic childhood explained Kissinger's preoccupation with security. It seeped into how he looked at the US foreign policy later on in his life. And if you think about his childhood, it's quite understandable actually. You see, Kissinger was born in Germany, and he witnessed the rise of Nazism. And as a Jewish person, he had a very difficult time. He grew up witnessing injustice and persecution, and this would rob him of any idealism from a very early age, and understandably so. He would see the world as inherently unjust. That's why there was no room for ethical considerations when it came to security. You see, security and safety was always top of mind for Kissinger. His family would manage to flee just a year before the war to begin a new life in the United States. Later on, Kissinger would be drafted into the US Army and be sent back to Europe. The horrors he would witness, including the Nazi concentration camps, would further entrench his realist worldviews. After the war, he would gain admission into Harvard University, and his education would open up an entry into the US administration. As a political scientist, he would serve as a consultant for various US agencies. Eventually, his growing reputation would get noticed by the upcoming President Richard Nixon. Eventually, Kissinger gets appointed as the Assistant for National Security Affairs, and then he becomes the head of the National Security Council, and eventually he becomes the United States Secretary of State. And at this point, Kissinger was the main man directing US policy, and he would embark on a ruthless campaign to extend US influence abroad no matter what the cost was. Now, this was even more apparent during the Vietnam War. As a refresher, the Vietnam War was a brutal, long conflict between the Communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. And this conflict was intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So now we're up to speed on what the Vietnam War was. Okay, so now it's important to know what Kissinger's role was in all of this. You see, before Kissinger joined Nixon's administration, he actually had been working with him to undermine peace talks by divulging confidential information that ended up prolonging the war. Because of him, the Vietnam War would drag on for 7 more years and ultimately cost the US $1 trillion in today's money. Later on, when he became Secretary of State, he would massively extend the US military operations into the neighboring country, into Cambodia, which by the way wasn't even fighting the US. Cambodia's only crime was that the Viet Cong, which were the communist soldiers opposing the US, had been escaping into their borders to avoid engaging with American troops. And Kissinger declared Cambodia as a military target without any kind of congressional authorization. What followed was a massive bombing campaign on Cambodia. and this probably killed hundreds of thousands of people, if not more. The economic cost was so significant that the country's GDP fell from $1.07 billion in 1968 to less than half in 1972. And according to some analysts, this carnage helped pave the way for the rise of Pol Pot. This was a brutal dictator in Cambodia who would go on to kill 1/5 of his country's population and completely deindustrialize it. Henry Kissinger's decision to bomb Cambodia would actually go on to serve as a precedent for the US to conduct similar drone strikes in neutral countries. So after the war, the US would actually move on to support the dictator Pol Pot in Cambodia by ensuring that the world would turn a blind eye to his mass killings. When years later the Vietnamese would finally invade and stop the genocide, the US would actually slap sanctions on them and block IMF loans to the country. And speaking of brutal dictators, Kissinger also backed Operation Condor in South America. This involved the assassination of many left-wing South American leaders, with CIA-backed coups to establish military juntas. As a result, tens of thousands of people would be killed and many more jailed or tortured or worse in the region. And all of this helped secure the US influence in the region. This kind of philosophy, this policy of furthering the US interest no matter what the cost, would be visible in other parts of the world as well. In Pakistan, the US supported the military when they engaged in the wholesale massacre of Bengalis. There's evidence that Kissinger actually said that he was pleased with the atrocities that were committed. And critics who were opposed to Henry Kissinger did not fare well either. There was a career diplomat by the name of Archer Kent Blood who criticized Kissinger and the US's stance on the genocide committed in East Pakistan at the time. He publicly denounced this, and then he was immediately recalled from his post. Now let's look over to Indonesia, where the country's dictator Suharto was planning an invasion of East Timor, and at this time, Kissinger would actually assure that the US would not intervene and give him the green light. And the aftermath of this was the death of nearly a quarter of the Timorese population. Okay, so far we talked about the horrific acts against humanity that Kissinger embraced and supported through his policies and his diplomatic relationships. But did he do any good at all? There was one region where, surprisingly, Kissinger's policies did not result in further human rights violations and bloodshed, and this was in the Middle East. During his tenure, the Yom Kippur War erupted, and during this time he displayed diplomatic brilliance. He played all sides to ensure US advantage. He would deliberately delay negotiations for ceasefire to give Israel a chance to capture more Egyptian territory. But at the same time, he would delay armed shipments to Israel to put pressure on them to accept the US post-war peace plan. He would then promise Egypt the return of its territory captured by Israel in return for their support. He would then utilize this leverage with Egypt alongside with the promise of weapons to convince the Saudi king to end his oil embargo on the West and on Israel. Okay, so this was a short and probably imprecise summary of events, but I wanted to pick out the parts that showed you Kissinger's brilliance, how he played all sides using diplomatic advantage to help negotiate a smoother path ahead. Now, was Kissinger performing an overwhelming act of kindness? Of course not, but it is an example to show that in some instances, he opted for a path where there would be fewer devastation and fewer casualties. Now, these types of examples, however, are very few and far between. Henry Kissinger was indeed a man of brilliance. He was a genius when it came to thinking creatively about foreign policy. He thought of ways to structure deals and foster relationships in ways that very few people at the time could do. But he had no moral compass. His determination to secure the US influence and security at all costs was devastatingly impressive. He passed away a few months ago, and his true legacy should be more of a cautionary tale rather than something to aspire to. If you like this video, you'll love this video that I made about the Great Depression. Check it out over here and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.